Since the videotaped murder of George Floyd at the hands of police officer Derek Chauvin, dozens of states have introduced legislation to end or limit police qualified immunity. Only 4 states have been successful. Colorado was the first. On this episode of Race Talk Revolution, Colorado State Representative Leslie Herod tells us how they did it and how we can advocate for similar legislation. She is joined by Ms. Lauren Bonds, Legal Director of the National Police Accountability Project, and 24-year police veteran Captain Lawrence Hunter of LMH Consulting Services. This episode originally aired December 22nd, 2021.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Good day, wherever you may be. Good to see everybody again. And happy holidays. And once again, I want to welcome you to another Race Talk Revolution program with Lane and Eugene. Race Talk Revolution is where your voice matters. And again, I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. And if you're new to the show, thank you so much for being here. And we invite you to come back when we start up our next 8-week series next month. Today, we are really blessed, really pleased to be partnering with the Anti-Racist Alliance and the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform to bring you an outstanding panel of experts for a discussion about the need to end qualified immunity for police officers. As always, during our conversation, we ask that you remain muted. And when we get to the Q&A section, we will instruct you on how to raise your hand so that you may ask your questions. Also, as a reminder, as I do every week, Race Talk Revolution is a loving, inclusive platform designed to strip away the false beliefs that keep us separated as human beings, uncover the not so hidden truth that we all really do want the same thing in life, and to heal the wounds created by systemic racism. Race Talk Revolution is a safe and brave space for people of all backgrounds to share ideas, opinions, and explore the nuances of systemic racism while together growing our capacity for effective anti-racist activism. The Race Talk Revolution community, we are committed, we are deeply committed to practicing radically inclusive love. So what that means is when we do not understand or agree with what's being shared or said, we are committed to listening with respect, we are committed to listening with appreciation, and we are committed to listening with empathy. You see, it is our commitment to every person that every person be encouraged, heard, and appreciated, because here in Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene, every voice matters. Now here's my co-host, Reverend Lane Cobb.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I am pleased to introduce to you our speakers for this episode. We're going to start with Representative Leslie Herod. She was elected in 2016 as the first LGBTQ African-American in the Colorado General Assembly. Since then, she has passed over 100 bills addressing criminal justice reform, mental health, addiction, youth homelessness, and civil rights protections. Representative Herod serves as chair of the Appropriations Committee, chair of the Black Caucus, and as a member of the powerful Joint Budget Committee. Representative Herod crafted and passed 3 comprehensive police accountability bills following the murder of George Floyd and Elijah McClain by police, including SB 20-217, making Colorado the first state to pass legislation eliminating police qualified immunity in the United States. She has a long list of accomplishments, including winning re-election in 2018 and championing a ballot initiative, Caring for Denver, that raises $35 million annually for mental health and substance abuse treatment and services for children and adults. She now serves as chair of the Caring for Denver Foundation Board, the largest mental health foundation in the state of Colorado. We are also pleased to have with us today Ms. Lauren Bonds. Lauren Bonds is the legal director of the National Police Accountability Project. In her role at NPAP, she works to remove legal barriers to police accountability through legislative advocacy and amicus support in cases of impact. She also provides legal and policy support to community groups working on police reform initiatives. Prior to joining MPAP, she served as the legal director of the ACLU of Kansas, where she represented Kansans in a range of civil rights actions and managed the affiliate's legal advocacy work. Prior to working for the ACLU, Lauren served as Assistant General Counsel at the Service Employees International Union, where she provided legal support to the union's fight for 15. I'm sorry, I don't understand. This is Ms. Bonds. You can clear this up when we unmute you. She provided legal support to the union's fight for $15 campaign and advised organizers on mass actions, organizing strategies, and international collaborations. Was that for minimum wage? Thank you. $15 minimum wage campaign. Thank you. Captain Lawrence Hunter is also with us. Captain Lawrence Hunter retired, began his law enforcement career in 1995 as an officer for the Waterbury Police Department in Connecticut. He served as a patrol officer, communications dispatcher, and field training officer before he was promoted to sergeant. He was one of the first members of the newly formed crisis intervention team and taught defensive tactics to recruits and veteran officers. In 2006, he was promoted to lieutenant and received training with the FBI Law Enforcement Executive Development Association Institute and became an instructor of fair and impartial policing, human behavior, and civil complaints. In 2017, he became a captain and was assigned to the Professional Standards Division as its commanding officer. Hunter retired from policing in 2019 as a night shift commander. He holds a bachelor's in psychology from the University of Phoenix and a master's in forensic psychology from Walden University. Welcome to all three of our guests today. Thank you all for taking time to talk with us about this critical topic in police and justice reform. Representative Herod, let's begin with you, if that is okay. We have read that SB 2217 is the first bill to be written into law banning police qualified immunity, and so far the only other states to do so are New Mexico, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, I believe, and New York City has also done so, but all bills are not created equal in terms of the protection that they provide to citizens. And we'd like to hear the story of your bill. We'd also be interested in learning whether you can provide us with a blueprint maybe for how we can get similar legislation passed in our states if we're interested. And I know we might not get through all of these questions, but I'm turning the mic over to you. Why did you craft this bill and how did you get it passed?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone. I am State Representative Leslie Herod, and I represent Denver, Colorado. We are the first state to have passed qualified immunity, ending qualified immunity law enforcement at the local level immediately after the murder of George Floyd and Elijah McClain. We also subsequently, the following year, passed House Bill, what was the number? I'm going to forget the number. But we passed, House Bill 1250, that ended qualified immunity for state patrol and Colorado Bureau of Investigations as well. So initially, we have the strongest qualified immunity bill, in my opinion, in the nation. And so what we did initially was we passed Senate Bill 217. And it's interesting because one of my colleagues actually said that the protests and the chants that we could hear outside of the Capitol was like the soundtrack for that bill. Like the energy was, we could feel it throughout the entire Capitol every single day as we passed the bill. In Colorado, we were on a COVID break from session. We came back into session and the protest started that week. And immediately the Black Caucus shifted gears and said, we're not only going to focus on, COVID and the pandemic, we also need to look at the pandemic of racism and police brutality that is affecting our community. And so we stood together in unity and demanded a bill that would address this very issue and other issues additionally in law enforcement accountability. So 217 was not only about qualified immunity. We negotiated that bill for 16 days. And in those negotiations, we had law enforcement and activists at the table every single day, hours a day, to negotiate the bill. I'm proud to say that the Senate president came on board and sponsored the bill in the Senate, and we were able to get it through in a suspended session. So we only had 20 days of session, and we were able to get that bill passed. We actually had support from Republicans and co-sponsorship from both sides of the aisle, and the law enforcement lobby was neutral. So there was no opposition from the law enforcement lobby as a whole once the bill was passed. Now, initially there was opposition. And so let me just go back and tell you guys a couple of things that the bill did, a few highlights. So yes, we ended qualified immunity for law enforcement. That's one piece. And then we additionally said that individual actors who act in bad faith to violate someone's civil rights also had a $25,000 personal responsibility, or 5% of the entire settlement, for what they did. So they had to pay that out of pocket. We negotiated that down from, I believe, $150,000, maybe $200,000 to that level, which was important because we needed room to negotiate, but we wanted to make sure there was still personal responsibility. Subsequently, now we do also have law enforcement insurance, where people law enforcement officers can personally buy insurance, not through their agency, but personally buy insurance, and mitigate some of those personal costs, which I think is a good thing. Similar to me driving my car, if something happens, I have insurance. They should be insured too, and they should be incentivized for good behavior, and also maybe do some of the other things like mental health checks, and also have access to their employment files. So that is now happening in the state of Colorado because of it. But additionally, there's some other provisions that are really important, that have actually led to charges being filed against, criminal charges being filed against officers. And that's two components: a duty to intervene and a duty to report. As you all know, when George Floyd was murdered, there were other law enforcement officers that were just standing around doing nothing, watching, not stopping, not intervening, not helping, for far too long, ending in his death. In Colorado now, law enforcement officers have a duty to intervene if there is harm being done to someone in the community by a fellow law enforcement officer. They also have a duty to report excessive use of force. If they do neither, they will be charged with a misdemeanor offense, and they will lose their license for up to a year, or I'm sorry, starting at a year, up to indefinitely for their involvement in the activities. They can also be charged with higher crimes for complacency, and for joining in and helping out in any way, whether they're backing someone up or clearing the scene. Any type of involvement to help the excessive force will also could lead to a higher charge: battery charges, abuse charges, and even murder charges. And in Colorado, we have seen almost a dozen officers being charged for failure to intervene and failure to report. We've also had officers really change the culture within their departments and stepping up and reporting when they hear of bad actions, or they see it on the camera, or they were involved but didn't feel safe. They have reported afterwards and have gotten law enforcement officers fired, their post certifications revoked, and charges being brought against their fellow officer. This is huge, and something I didn't realize would have the impact that it does. Additionally, we require all law enforcement officers by 2023 to have body cameras. Every single officer in the state of Colorado must have a body camera. Every single jail and agency must have cameras as well. Anyone interacting with the public face-to-face, not email, obviously not phone, has to have a body camera on and recording. If they tamper with their body camera, they turn it off. They are basically presumed to have acted in the wrong, as opposed to the presumption going on the defendant. That has also made a huge change in the state of Colorado. We also have pattern and practice investigation that we gave to the Attorney General, because the feds rarely ever step in to investigate law enforcement agencies that act outside of their power, or that are not acting in the best interest of their citizens. Aurora, Colorado is a good example of that. Some of you may have seen the cases publicly around Elijah McClain's murder, but also around the deaths or the treatment of protesters and others. I don't know if you all have heard of the case where there was a young mom driving with her kids in a van. The girls were in princess costumes. They were very, very young. They were thrown on the hot pavement in 100-degree heat, asked to lay on their bellies. with their arms spread for far too long amount of time. Some of them actually suffered low-degree burns, and they said that the car had been stolen. The car had not been stolen. It was their car. The car they were looking for was actually a motorcycle, not a van. And so the Attorney General stepped in and investigated the Department of the Aurora Police Department, found that they had acted not only against the civil rights of their citizens, but racistly, I shall say. And they are now under a consent decree with the state of Colorado. If they don't change, they will be taken up by the state and sued as well. And so those things have all happened because of 217. We also have new data reporting requirements, so we can finally track racial profiling, which, man, how long have we been talking about that? And intervene where needed. And so the bill was really an omnibus bill. It wasn't just one thing, because one thing is not going to solve the problems in our system. One bill, even 217, is not going to solve the problems in our system, but it definitely has created change within police departments in Colorado. We could not have gotten it done without the help of activists who were outside protesting and chanting, parents who have lost their child, like Shanine McClain, and law enforcement officers, former and current, who stepped in and said, this needs to happen for the state of Colorado. And so I'm proud to say that bill was signed on Juneteenth. And the governor even took that in as a very clear message that it has a real impact, not only on the lives of all Coloradans, but definitely on the lives of Coloradans of color. Yeah. And I'm proud to say that we passed that. So thank you so much for being here. I do look forward to questions at the end and more questions now, but that's basically the story of 217 and the subsequent work that happened in the previous sessions as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Herod. Let me ask you a question. I know that you said that you didn't have any, well, initially there was some opposition from law enforcement, but then that changed. But was there any other opposition that this bill faced?
Yeah, so it's interesting. At first, they were very opposed. If you listen to the hearings, you'll hear it. I mean, they basically called me the devil and anti-law enforcement. And I should add that my father is a retired law enforcement officer of 30 years. He was a correctional officer at Supermax, worked his way up from a groundskeeper to the head of internal investigations. And he worked in law enforcement and put food on our table through that opportunity. And so I'm very grateful to him and his service. But I knew I needed to work on this issue when he would no longer tell my nieces what he did for a living that got us to where we are today, because of the shame around it, because of how other law enforcement officers were acting. And when I heard the conversations he was having with his grandkids, I could tell it was different than the pride he felt when he was working within those agencies. And I worked with him to think about what we needed to do, to figure out what was real and what was kind of hyperbole. Knowing that he had done internal investigations, I thought it was important to work with him. But initially, of course, I said I was the devil as anti-law enforcement. I want to bankrupt all these officers and make sure they can't send their kids to school. But of course, if you are a good officer, and you don't do that, you won't have any of these repercussions. So it's really interesting to see. But they went neutral. It does not mean they weren't opposed behind the scenes. And it does not mean they weren't working every single day when no one really was in the Capitol except for people working on this bill because of COVID to undermine it or to kill it. Interestingly enough, we also had opposition from the far left that maybe thought it wasn't strong enough. And I mean, you have to remember, we were in the heat of protests. I was a protester too, so that helped that I was out there, but I also brought them in, the ones who are, I think, more rational in to have that conversation. But remember, there are some folks who don't believe in government at all, and they don't believe that a bill is going to help at all, right? And they don't want that. And so we did have opposition from like the Democratic Socialists in some way, but we were able to quell that a lot. In fact, one of the activists who helped negotiate the bill is now running for office, which I think is going to be a great thing to see. And so we have all come a long way on this bill together, and I think that's really important. a former law enforcement officer that is on the Republican side of the aisle, was actually one of my very close confidants within this conversation. Because again, he knew, right, what was going to work and what wasn't going to work, what language we needed to put in around duty to intervene and report, body camera tampering and all of that, you know, because he'd seen it, he'd done it. And while he did not vote for the bill, he helped to craft it behind the scenes, which was really, really helpful. The other odd partner, which this might be a little bit inside baseball, was a group called the Independence Institute. And the Independence Institute is a very conservative organization that helps to get uber conservative Republicans elected to office in states across the nation. They are akin to the NRA, and probably have more power now than NRA. They're under ALEC. And they actually came in and supported the bill with my Republican colleagues. They did a lunch and learn. And I had worked with them on a couple of other issues, which is always fascinating. But they did a lunch and learn, and they helped them to understand that from their perspective, the libertarian perspective, that there needed to be, we need to rein in government control. And this was one piece of government control and overreach. So it was an odd partnership. And I think it happened in a time where things were extremely heightened and people were watching. With Elijah McClain's murder and the other families that stepped forward, people from across the state of Colorado, not just Denver, but rural Colorado, suburban Colorado, all sent emails. One of my colleagues said she got 40,000 emails from her constituents about this issue. And so we're grateful that it's passed in Colorado. We're grateful that it worked. And I mentioned subsequently the State Patrol. The next year was put under qualified immunity as well. It was actually a request of the State Patrol to end qualified immunity. And so they testified in support of the bill because they didn't want to be different from their colleagues at the local level. And they wanted to be kind of the gold standard of law enforcement agencies in the state and across the nation. So I now work with Captain Hahn a lot on not only this issue, but other issues impacting the criminal legal system. So I think it's interesting, the unlikely partnerships that came together around this. I don't want to downplay it because we did move people to neutral, that it was easy. I mean, those negotiations were tough. There were fits, there were, tears, there were all kinds of things that happened. There were death threats. I mean, I had a gun to my head at one point, literally. But it was all worth it to be where we are today and to see the real changes being made. So we'll continue on with the work. It's not over. Police accountability is not done in the state of Colorado, but we've done a lot. So we're excited about that. Yeah, that's where we are.
Oh, I can't move beyond that comment you made about actually literally having a gun to your head.
That's sorry, it's very protective.
I hear you. And the good. And we don't need to hear the story, but what I want to say is a thank you for being who you needed to be to do what you needed to do. It sounds like that was that collaboration story, right? We need that type of collaboration. And there's somebody that's saying, how much did your friendly connection with powerful folks on the other side of the aisle facilitate the success of the bill, right? Because that's what needs to happen. You're also clearly saying that pressure from citizens needs to also happen. We're very interested in how to get this done. You talked about the wording that needed to be in there, right? That people who are opposed to this type of legislation will attach to a piece of wording and then trash the entire bill. I don't know if there's a blueprint somewhere for you that you have you written something that would help us to craft this type of thing in other states?
Well, I would love to write something, but I have not because the work is so intense right now and continues. And it's so funny. My good friend and colleague, he often reminds me that I needed to write everything down, and I'm not. So I need to get back to that. But I do talk about it a lot. So I think I have a good record. So what I will say is that first, thank you for acknowledging like the harm that gets done to folks who are running these bills. It shouldn't be understated. And I know that my other colleagues felt pressure as well, more behind the scenes because people were too afraid to speak about it publicly because of the horrendous examples we were able to give. We all have horrendous examples in every single one of our states, though. We know that. And it just needs to get the attention. And it's hard. Elijah McClain was murdered months before anyone cared. But because we brought his mom into the debate, literally on the first day, that is when the press went global around what happened to him. And we actually honored Elijah McClain on the day of its passage and his mom and made a tribute right before the vote to her. Literally, I broke all the rules and did that because she deserved that acknowledgement. And what I will say is that, yes, absolutely, my relationships with the other side of the aisle helped. My relationships with the Independence Institute helped. We worked on another issue, asset forfeiture in my first year, civil asset forfeiture, which we also reined in Colorado under Republican leadership in the Senate and the Democratic leadership in the House. But building those relationships as someone who's willing to have the conversation helps. Now, do they, it's really interesting because I think it kind of made it clear that I was a force, but I've been doing this work already. And so we had already done things like defelonize simple possession of drugs with a bipartisan bill as well. And so relationships always matter. But so does the support of my colleagues. When I got the bill introduced, not only did we have the Black and Latinx caucus members as names on both the House and the Senate bills, but I was able to convince every single one of my Democratic colleagues to sign on as well, which meant that they would have to be pulled off of the bill instead of brought onto the bill. So that meant I only had to negotiate with Republicans. We had to keep Democrats. That's real. And that was very tough. But because I had leadership on my side, I'm now in leadership, we were able to get those things done. I got to also acknowledge one person I forgot to mention, which is really important, actually two people, which is Mari Newman, who was the attorney for Elijah McClain's mother and the estate, who actually came to me before we even introduced this bill to write a bill for Elijah McClain. And I could not get support for it until the murder of George Floyd. So I couldn't even get it introduced. So what a 360, but she was there negotiating every single day and had the firsthand experience of a civil rights attorney who tries these cases day in and day out and knew what would actually help lead to a better outcome for these families. Additionally, the ACLU and the criminal defense bar were very involved in negotiations too. I am not a lawyer. I play one in the legislature sometimes, but I'm not a lawyer. And I do not practice in these areas. And so I think it's really important that we have not only academics doing the work, but folks who are there trying these cases all the time to really help to, again, make change and not just make us feel good as legislators for passing something that says qualified immunity. We know that some of the other bills in other states will not have impact because of how they were watered down at the last minute. We did not take our eyes off the ball on this bill at all. And so I think that's really important. It was a lot of work.
Thank you so very much. I want to go to Ms. Lauren Bonds. Ms. Bonds, I have a question for you. In ending qualified immunity, I know that that's one of your major platforms for your lobbying firm. Are there other police accountability issues on your agenda?
Yeah, and first, thank you, Eugene and Lane, so much for having us on. And Representative Herod, I still have my pen in my hand because I've been taking so many notes about how you got this done in Colorado. So so grateful for you to share your expertise here. But we definitely see qualified immunity as our number one issue. Let me give you a little bit of background on the National Police Accountability Project. So we are a national nonprofit organization that's made up of about 600 lawyers who are trying law enforcement misconduct cases in civil courts. And our main mission is making sure that people who are injured by police officers, correction officers, and prison guards have a way to be made whole through civil rights actions and to hold the people who are responsible for their injuries accountable. And so qualified immunity really is kind of the biggest barrier to us being able to accomplish our mission. But there are other things that make it a lot harder to pursue civil rights actions as well, including, restrictions on transparency into law enforcement records. So it's really hard to be able to put a case together and be able to draft a complaint that's going to make it through kind of the first round to dismiss that people have to go through when they file a civil rights action. If you don't have any information, you're kind of grasping in the dark saying, well, I think this police officer did this, and we think that they were trained to do this in this way. So without that information, it's very, very difficult to be able to put together a case that's going to be able to empower someone to hold a law enforcement officer accountable in civil court. Another major area that we're focused on is law enforcement Bill of Rights statutes. So these are statutes that are in place in about 22 different states. And basically what they say is that law enforcement has all these additional protections that when they are accused of misconduct. So you hear a lot about union contracts and police union contracts being what protect law enforcement officers. There's also in a number of states these protections in state law that say, only a police officer can be interviewed by another police officer when they do something wrong. So that eliminates, civilian oversight boards or all the information that they have, that's in their disciplinary record can't be released to the public. That's something that really interferes with civil rights litigation. And, we see these statutes, a bunch of them were enacted right after the riots and the uprisings in Los Angeles in the early 90s. And now we're seeing them being enacted again. Georgia and Missouri both just passed a law enforcement Bill of Rights statute in this last year. And so we're not only working to get these statutes off the books, we're trying to make sure more aren't enacted because they are such a barrier to all different types of accountability, law enforcement accountability, whether that be in civil rights cases, or through, kind of other community measures of accountability like civilian oversight boards or just kind of through political advocacy to get a problematic officer removed. And I see that the question in the chat was answered. Yeah, National Police Accountability Project, we go by NPAP. So.
Thank you so very much. So let me ask, what type of response are you receiving from legislation? And are you noticing any forward progress within that?
Yeah, so, we really are focusing our efforts both in the legislatures and the courts. And when we say the legislatures, we mean state legislatures, but we also are, looking at Congress and what can be done there. I'll say kind of at the federal level, if you're just paying attention to the news, whether it's about police accountability or any other issue that's big in our country right now, you'll see that there's a pretty big barrier to any type of progress in the Senate. So I think that we've become aware of the fact that even though there are a lot of exciting ideas and there is a lot of political will from federal lawmakers to enact meaningful police accountability reform, it's not going to happen. I think we saw that most prominently with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that was introduced back in 2020, reintroduced in 2021, passed the House both times with overwhelming support, and then hit kind of a bottleneck in the Senate. And, we waited this summer listening to, Senator Tim Scott and Senator Booker, talk about their negotiations. We heard, things are getting figured out, things are not getting figured out. And the real point of contention that was happening there during those negotiations and discussions was over the inclusion of qualified immunity reform in the Justice and Policing Act. And so that's really where the legislation fell apart and the reason it didn't pass the Senate. And so I would say that there is pretty strong opposition to qualified immunity reform by lawmakers, even though unfortunately, there's broad public support. Polling shows us that there's broad public support for this. And so for that reason, I think NPAP has really tried to focus its efforts on state level reforms and even municipal level reforms when it comes to qualified immunity. So, we know that there are certain states where this is possible. Representative Herod just told us about kind of the gold standard, what can happen when you're able to get all your ducks in a row and make something happen in Colorado. And, I think a lot of people might dismiss qualified immunity reform as something that, is just what activists want. and is just, important for, it is just important to Democrats. But as Representative Herod explained, in Colorado, there was broad support by kind of the libertarian parts of the Republican Party. We're seeing that in other places too. We worked pretty heavily in New Mexico last year to get them to enact their elimination of qualified immunity. And I think some of the strongest supporters in New Mexico were kind of libertarians, people who were affiliated with the Institute for Justice, people who were affiliated with the Cato Institute. And that's why, we've been able to, that's why that legislation was able to pass there. And so, and then you look at places that are really progressive and have, very kind of the Democratic trifecta, and you don't even see some qualified immunity reform bills getting out of, their initial committee there. So I think it really is, a matter of making sure that there are strong, coalitions that are in support of the legislation, and also making sure that, you're telling the right stories and providing the right messages. And I think Colorado is the case study for how it can be done well. I think New Mexico is another one. And, we're very excited for this upcoming, round of state legislative sessions, and think that there's a lot of opportunity, particularly in places like New York and Washington and Maryland.
Thank you. What you said about the states that have like the Democratic trifecta, and then, things still not passing in favor of human rights. We're kind of looking at that here. I know that you've been active helping people in New York State try to pass some end to qualified immunity. I'm just curious about, how that's going, but also to talk about something that's a little bit near and dear to our hearts here in Westchester County. It was a very high profile case where Mr. Kenneth Chamberlain lost his life in a heinous act of police misconduct, and the officers were not charged. And there's been an award-winning movie about it that we've been asking everybody to watch. And so New York is considered to be very liberal, and right, this is still happening. So I guess, how do we keep people active? So one of the things that happens is people get real active after a high profile case, and then they get complacent again. What do you say to the citizenry?
Yeah, I think that's such a, that's the $1 million golden question, right? Like, how do we keep people engaged when, last session was really when people were most focused on policing in light of the uprisings over the summer and the more recent deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and a number of other, unfortunate murders. I think one of the things that we're learning and wanting to make sure that we keep, front and center for so many people is making sure that, like, we're talking about all the different cases, right? Like, there's going to be maybe one high profile case a year, if that. But the thing that we know at the National Police Accountability Project is that these things happen every day. Our 600 attorneys who are taking these cases across the country literally have a report of law enforcement misconduct every day, literally have a report of an unjustified murder by a law enforcement officer every single day. And so I think it's a matter of making sure that we're uplifting those stories, right? Even if it's not something that's going to get a lot of national attention, making sure that we're keeping front and center the long-term impacts of what that violence looks like. So in New York State, yes, I just saw this in the chat. A4 331 and S 1991. That is the bill that NPAP is supporting with the help of we're supporting in qualified immunity New York in their support of that bill. But I think it's really important to make sure that we're showing the harms and not just kind of jumping on whatever is the most recent case. And the harms aren't always just someone can't recover in court. The harms are that it's delaying people's access to justice. So you mentioned Kenneth Chamberlain. That's a case where that's a situation where qualified immunity is just extending and extending and extending this person's pursuit of justice, right? Because the thing about qualified immunity, one of its doctrinal quirks is, like, even if the lower court is saying no, you aren't entitled to qualified immunity, at every point where they assert that defense, they get to take it up on appeal immediately. And we know from studies that extends litigation by a year every single time there's an appeal taken. So that results in situations where someone who's lost a loved one, who's been injured by a police officer, even if there isn't even a valid qualified immunity defense, they get to keep appealing it, and that their cases are taking 5 to 10 years instead of 2 to 3 like they should.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm, I'm speechless. I just want to say thank you for the effort, and for keeping us honest, right? Because it is so easy to get distracted and to allow our anger about things to create for us to be ineffective. So how do we, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to have some questions for Captain Hunter. Um, it's just a matter of calling your congressman. I mean, it's a matter of, organizing. I know that we plan to have more forums like this. What would you say is, and I know there's no magic formula, but if you had one.
Yeah, and so I'm so happy that Katerina Sierra from NQI New York is on the call. She actually dropped a link to their website in the chat. I think everybody should go there. They have really fantastic action steps that I think are targeted to what the current needs of the legislation are. So, I think in New York in particular, there's this issue with making sure that there's leadership is invested in this particular reform. And so I think think it's really important to stay informed about what's going on. Legislative procedure can be, inside baseball. It can be very complicated and inaccessible. I realize that. But I think it's important to follow groups like NQI New York, who can kind of break it down and say, like, here's where we're targeting, here's where our needs are. So you're not just kind of yelling into the void, like, we need to pass unqualified immunity reform or pass unqualified immunity. Instead, you're, targeting those messages to the people who really need to hear it, not preaching to the choir or preaching to people who are never going to listen to us. So I think it's really important to find those groups that are working on these issues in your state, and in New York, that is NQI New York. And I think, in addition to calling your representative or your senator, it's really important to make sure that you're kind of getting involved and getting kind of boots on the ground and attending things, whether it be forums like this or, lobby days or other, opportunities to show up, because that's really what so many legislators look at. They look at bodies, they look at like physical representations of support. And even, I know COVID is nuts right now, particularly in New York, but I think finding virtual forums where you can really show your attendance and show your support is so important.
Yeah, thank you. And there's, as someone put in the chat, I think it was Sue, just for us to keep in mind that police unions are organizing and out there strongly advocating for their positions. So we need to advocate just as strongly for ours. Thank you so much for being here. Captain Hunter, so you have spent your career in law enforcement, and we talked, and you told me that there is a good deal of misinformation about qualified immunity legislation circulated among police officers, which causes a lot of fear and anger. And I'd be interested in hearing, I know you have a little bit of a different take on this, perhaps. Can you speak on that a bit? I know that, they're afraid of being financially ruined, afraid of just that people are saying, oh, if there's qualified immunity, if there's ending of qualified immunity, then it'll be a free-for-all and there'll be no law enforcement. Tell me what you're hearing and what your take on all this is, please.
Sure. Excuse me. So thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So yes, I talked to a number of police officers, and they have been very concerned about the possible ramifications of such a bill being passed. Now, here in Connecticut, Colorado was the first, and I'm pretty sure that Connecticut was the second state to pass something that dealt with qualified immunity. And when I read Colorado's and Connecticut's, they're almost very, very similar as far as the things that they're calling for: body cameras, police officers being having their certifications revoked, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of officers are very scared of this. And this comes from the majority of the time, and just a misunderstanding, whether it's deliberate or intentional, I don't know, by police unions who are telling them that it's going to be a free-for-all. We won't be able to hire and retain enough police officers when and if they get on the job. They'll take your house, they'll take everything from you. So that causes a lot of fear, anger, and panic amongst them. They think police officers are very much the circle the wagon type of individuals, where they think it's us versus them. They don't believe that the vast majority of people out in the public understand what it is that they do and how they get things done. And so therefore, because there's a lack of understanding, they don't like that power taken away from them because you don't understand what it takes in order to get the job done. So that fear needs to be assuaged as much as possible. It's an uphill battle, uphill fight, because they are very nervous, and therefore, as we heard from Representative Herod and from Ms. Bonds, that they're going to resist, whether it's through unions or, unfortunately, through the violent threats. I don't know if a police officer did that to Ms. Herod, put the gun to her head, which is a horrible, horrible story, but it shows you how entrenched some of these ideas are about law and order and things along those lines.
Well, and thank you for that. And what you told me on the phone was that in some cases you support QI, in other cases you do not. Can you specify a little bit about when would it be appropriate and when might it not be appropriate in your eyes?
Yeah, so I think it's extremely difficult because we want police officers to do their job and not become hesitant. And whether the information is correct or not, there's someone out there who may hesitate. There is a police officer who may hesitate in order to do certain things. Now, one of the problems that comes with qualified immunity, we can read, anyone who's done any type of research about this will read about horrendous cases of police officers shooting into crowds, shooting to kill a dog in one instance, and then hitting a child, and just other horrendous stories in which they were granted qualified immunity. It is an inconsistent standard that is set across the country, whether you're in Connecticut and they may institute qualified immunity, then you go to Tennessee and they may not. So it's really just it's really a rough shot. So I think we need to really restrict when and if they can be used, and that's going to take legislative action about when it can be done. One of the things about qualified immunity is that it has to be a deliberate, something that a police officer knew by established precedent in a legal sense, right? Not in the law, but in legal precedent. In other words, the Supreme Court or a higher judicial court said that any police officer in this circumstance should have known that what they did was wrong. Well, that's an almost impossible standard to meet because every circumstance is going to be different. And so therefore, I would like to see that type of loophole closed. I'm not for eliminating qualified immunity overall, but I am in favor of certainly limiting it to the circumstances in which an officer knew what they did was not only illegal according to precedent in courts, but also just common sense, right? Why are you shooting at the dogs and hitting individuals? There needs to be a common sense, but how do you legislate that? How do you write that? You know, I don't have the answer to that.
Eugene, you're muted.
Thank you. Didn't know I did that. Thank you so much for being here, number one. So in regards to what you just said, we hear, a lot about the blue wall, police and justice department creating a unified front in terms of acceptable conduct in policing, and which is often in contrast to the public opinion. So my question is this sustainable?
Is the blue wall sustainable?
Correct.
I think it's slowly crumbling and eroding. When you see the laws concerning the duty to intervene, and as we heard from Representative Herod, that this has had a drastic effect. If we can remember, there was a police officer who was fired, I believe in the 1990s. She was fired for doing exactly what officers are being mandated to do now, and that is the duty to intervene. That was in Buffalo, New York. Wow. She has since been given her pension back because she was right in what she did. So that's how strong the blue wall was. And now the blue wall in everything that we've talked about here is not only the effect of police administrations supporting this, but it's also government officials supporting this, right? Because they have thought for a long time that this is the way that we need our police officers to behave in order to control certain populations. Let's just be clear about that. This is what they thought needed to be done in order to get the job done. And so when it starts coming to your doorstep, then by them, I'm talking about public officials. When it starts coming to their doorstep, then it becomes a serious, serious problem. Someone was talking about asset forfeiture, and that has been a big problem. And asset forfeiture is a major problem across the country. But it wasn't until it came to a mayor's home in a town in Maryland that he began to step up and say, this is an issue. So what George Floyd unfortunately revealed is that it showed the world what African Americans have been complaining about for years, for more than a century. And so it's unfortunate. And I agree with Ms. Bonds when she said, in order to keep this momentum going, you have to continue to talk about this and talk about how these officers are behaving in certain circumstances every day.
Yeah. Which brings me to my question. I have a question before we take you to Q&A. And you started to go there. So what is your view on how this is going to turn out? In your estimation, is there any way that police officers and the public can work together to improve the quality of policing, especially when it comes to police violence against citizens?
I think the biggest thing is for police officers to reach out, to enact policies, procedures, and to show this transparency and accountability that we are asking for. I think that's the first thing. And as that grows and as public sentiment grows, then the next thing is for the public to reach back and become cooperative with police. Because in many instances, not only do individuals within their communities refuse to cooperate with police because of fear of retaliation from the drug dealer up the street, but they just haven't trusted police. So we've got to get that trust in police back, and it's going to take these transparency bills. It's going to take officers going to jail, police officers being fired. It's going to take that, and that's going to help to build the trust. And then the public is going to have to reciprocate by becoming cooperative with police, because the end result is safety in our communities. And what's it going to take for our communities to be safe? It's going to take police officers who do the job effectively, efficiently, and they cannot do that without the help of the public.
Yeah. Whew. Yes, interesting. Very, very interesting. I want to open this up now for our Q&A for our listeners here, and our participants, our family here, to ask questions. And so again, the way that you do that is take your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, the right-hand side, hit reactions, then press the raise hand button. If it's not there, go to participants, which is second from the left, and click on that. You find your name, and then on the three dots over the right-hand side, you should find the ability to raise your hand there. All righty. There's too many windows for Lane and I to try to keep a track of, and people are doing this. Okay, so if you can use that. That form of raising your hand, that would be most appreciated. All righty. So we have Joseph, we have Tyrone, then we have Daria. Joe? Come in, Joe.
I know what's happening, Joe. Usually you're right on it. Should we go to Tyrone until you figure out how to unmute? Oh, there you go.
I'm sorry. Apologize for that. Thank you, Eugene. My questions to the guest panel. I'm not sure which individual would like to answer this question, but I posted it in the chat. And my question is this: when it comes to the negotiation of the police union contract, is there any way for a community representative to get a seat at the table? Or maybe you've had some experience with the community wanting to participate in the negotiation of that police union contract. There have been some law review articles where they propose a model where a member of the community has a seat at the table with the negotiating team for the municipality or the employer, so that their voice can be heard in the police negotiations. Because what typically what can happen is that the municipality may pass legislation and do all types of police reform, but then they run into the wall of, well, our union contract won't let us do any of that. We've already negotiated the contract and we can't do these things. And my question is, okay, what can the community do to have a more proactive role and shape and participate in what the municipality negotiates with its police union?
I think that would be very, very difficult, and that's going to depend on local municipalities in themselves. It's been my experience that people are generally hostile towards any type of city government negotiations, right? They don't want anyone getting a raise, et cetera. I think it's nice to try to get people at the table to know what's going on. But in some cases, there's policies, there's laws prohibiting that. So you have to change that type of thing.
Yeah, and I would just echo Captain Hunter here that there oftentimes are laws in place that prevent community participation. I think one really exciting piece of legislation that NPAP is watching this year is in Washington state that effectively kind of removes some of those barriers and mandates that there is public participation and community participation in bargaining contracts. So, and I know that there's a number of other organizations, I think you identified some of them, Joe, that like, have proposed the model. I know Local Progress has done, an organization called Local Progress has done a lot of work to make sure that bargaining is more inclusive. And I think Austin, Texas has like went through a bargaining cycle where a elected community member or a selected community member was able to participate. So I think it's definitely possible, but I would, echo that sometimes there are kind of legislative and statutory restrictions from that happening.
Yeah, and right now, Colorado is not a strong union state anymore, if I'm being honest. And right now, the unions, SEIU and others who did support our bill are trying to do collective bargaining agreements for local government employees, which would include law enforcement agencies. And there's a lot of tension within the Black Caucus and Progressive Caucus to allow that to happen. Because we don't want to allow the unions to gain more strength. And so it's interesting because, they are at these tables. They are union or they are employees who could be unionized. In some places, they have smaller unions with less power. So giving them more power is something that we're going to be, I think, challenged with in the next session. And so these ideas around requiring a community at the table is one idea. And I think we'll probably do a lot more if they want to see that bill passed. And so it's interesting. It really, I think, pulls at some of our progressive values, but we know what happens when these unions gain power.
Thank you so very much. My brother Tyrone, and then Daria, and then Sue.
Sister Barnes, and Captain Hunter, and Honorable Representative Leslie Harrod. Thank you all so much for being on the show. Representative Harrod, I have a question for you. And I posted really early, I think you touched on some of it, but I want to hear a little bit more of how you were able to negotiate the whole police union opposition. Clearly, it's opposition across the planet, at least.
Yeah.
But can you speak a little bit to that for me, please? I'm interested in hearing your viewpoint.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the police lobby in Colorado really includes the DAs, the chiefs of police, the sheriffs, the metro chiefs, the rules, and then also the FOP. And so it's interesting because they have a lot of power. I mean, there is at least one of those officers in every single person's district, but in many districts, there are multiples, especially those who represent rural areas. So legislators have a lot of pressure from law enforcement. And one thing I learned when working on asset forfeiture is the people that have the most access to the governor who could veto your bill or engage in your bill in a negative way is law enforcement. They're with them every single day, every second. And so they have a lot of power in the ear of many. The FOP was probably the strongest opposition that we had to deal with to get them to go to neutral. I think because the Metro chiefs broke from once they broke from the traditional law enforcement lobby, we were able to move folks to neutral. I think that was really helpful. So you've got to understand that they don't all move as one, and they do act differently. Metro chiefs tend to be a little bit more progressive on issues and tend to, well, let me give you a little, I can't attribute this to anybody because I will be in trouble. But what I will say is that there were law enforcement officers, chiefs of police specifically, and some sheriffs who came to me and said, because of the way that FOP is, right, we can't fire these officers, or we've had a really hard time firing these officers. If you wrote a law that took that ability out of our hands, we would have it out of our hands. Then we wouldn't have to deal with this, you know? And that's why we actually pulled into Connecticut's law around decertifying officers immediately when they have excessive use of force. And so that is no longer up for debate. If you have excessive use of force, then you will not be a law enforcement officer in the state of Colorado ever again, not just in that jurisdiction, but in any jurisdiction. And so that was helpful for them. You know, I think it's really important to ask them what's going to be helpful for them to do their jobs privately, and then let that be, you know, not push them to be public about it or tweet about it or bring their agency along, because that might happen. And they're most concerned about losing the trust of their officers, of the rank and file. The one opposition that came in late that I always caution people to look out for is the Wives of Police Association. It was a new organization that formed, and they were in late, but they could have been more effective. And they brought those arguments of, we're going to lose our jobs, we're going to lose our house. You know, my husband can't speak out. And I say this specifically because they call themselves wives. My husband can't speak out, so I will. And they came with a lot more passion and stories about, you know, their officers coming home every day, like worn out and tired and beaten down. And just, it was compelling. So I caution that voice is strong. So you have to know that that's going on in the community, and those lies that are circulating are intentional, because those fear tactics, they know it. In Colorado, we have lost no more officers than any other state during this time, unless they were removed because of wrongdoing. And so, yes, we have less amount of law enforcement on streets right now, but we have a shortage in every single profession. You know, I'm on the budget committee. This is what we watch for the state of Colorado. And we know that there's not nurses, there's not teachers, there's not janitors, there's not truckers. You know, the supply chain is down, employment is down, and law enforcement is actually faring better than other groups. And so that's just not true. And people know it's not true.
Thank you. Daria.
Hi, I want to thank everybody like everyone else has done, but I'm calling and asking this question because I'm looking at my own town, which has a civilian police complaint review board, and but they have it written into their, I don't know if it's regulations or their whatever, that they have to basically look at the complaint after the police, someone in the police department has interviewed the police person that was the complaint about, and they can only take everything from that written statement. They can't interview the police officer themselves or the complainant. So somebody had mentioned previously when they were talking that there are some states, and this is in New York, that don't let, only another police officer can interview a police officer that's involved in the altercation. Does New York have such a law? Does anyone know?
So I don't believe New York has a law enforcement Bill of Rights law like that. It's very possible that those same kind of protections are written into your city's union contract, though. That's usually, like, sometimes there's double protection both with the contract and the LEBOR, but a lot of the times that the things that end up in those statutes are what you would see in most police department, in many police department contracts. So I might look there for those restrictions.
So it'd probably be more local rather than state. Okay,
it's very possible, yeah.
And it's also important to look at making sure that people can see officers record too for pattern and practice of abuse and violations. A lot of local citizens oversight boards do not have that ability. And so that's also problematic, and they don't have subpoena power, which really just makes them an advisory board to a group that won't listen. And so I think it's really important to make sure that those additional protections are there, or powers are there, if you want to make sure these oversight boards are more than just in name only.
That's right.
My dog is very vocal about this whole subject.
Thank you, Daria. Okay, we have Sue and then Leah.
Hi, thanks to all the panelists. That was really informative. I've been thinking about this for a long time too, and I've done some research. I'm from Yonkers, New York, and fully 1/3 of our budget is for police. And I just feel like it's too much. And I've read about defunding the police and refunding other services in our community. And I think that's the way we need to go. But the powerful, and I'm on a civil service retirement myself. So it's not that I am against retirement, but I just don't see why. Well, the other thing is crime statistics are hard to find. We get a lot of publicity when the police, they don't kill someone. It's all over the news that they didn't kill someone, that they took into custody. It's great news. They have a wonderful PR department, but we don't really know about the crime statistics. And I feel very strongly that we're paying as citizens way too much of our budget in every municipality, especially Yonkers, for policing. And yet they keep telling us this is what you need because crime is rampant. Well, I don't think it is rampant. And I'd like to know, how can we get more statistics on what crime is really? Because truthfully, what I see is not conclusive. And thanks again.
If I could speak to that, yes, what you said is a major problem. That the FBI attempts to gather statistics, but it's up to local municipalities to submit those stats, right? So that's an issue. So what people have to do is kind of push for their local municipalities to make sure that their police departments submit those stats to the FBI, so you can get an accurate picture of them. Local municipalities may or may not release those stats about crime. Unfortunately, some municipalities will play with the numbers. So, in order to make it seem as if things are worse than they are. And this is what I talked about before. You have to really be engaged and involved in making sure that your local municipality, that you know what your local municipality is doing, right? And that they are they releasing stats? Are they gathering stats? Are they taking stats and all that kind of thing? It's really, really a problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and it's important to look at those stats over a period of time that's longer than a couple of years, because we were in COVID, so crime was way down. We've actually were able to, in Colorado, close prisons. And before that, crime was also going down. And so, yes, we see a steep incline in crime, and that's happening across the world, not just in this country, not just where there is conversation of police accountability. And what is the common denominator? COVID, clearly, and despair, and people losing their jobs, and mental health from isolation, and kids not in school. Those are the things that we need to get at. Substance misuse is up because of those factors, not because of accountability, right? And so we got to make sure that, yes, what you just said, we're putting money in other places. That's why I created Caring for Denver, because people were not doing that. We needed to put more money in mental health and substance misuse services, and we weren't. And so we actually created STAR, Support Team Assisted Recovery Response, that now when you call 911 in Denver, Colorado for a mental health or substance misuse crisis, you can get a mental health professional and an EMT instead of law enforcement. We 100% stole that idea from Eugene, Oregon. Cahoots have been doing that for so long. They are an amazing, amazing, amazing organization that we all need to model in our states, and we are putting funding behind that here. We had to fund that through Caring for Denver because law enforcement wouldn't do it and the city wouldn't do it. Now, because we have had such a positive impact, the city is putting millions of dollars into that to expand it throughout the city for every single shift and to make sure that we have enough workers available. And so look into models like that. And what I would say is you don't have to necessarily say it's in opposition to the police budget because that puts you in a negative stance, but really say, let's try this too. There's a lot of money for programs like this right now. The federal ARPA dollars can be used for this stuff. The federal recovery dollars can be used for this. And so make sure that that we're doing those programs, putting them in place, not putting them at the hands of law enforcement, but instead putting them in the hands of a behavioral health organization who's trained to respond in this way. And then as that starts to work, then you can argue for less need for police budgets to be increased. And hey, guess what? If you stop having to pay all these lawsuits out because you have better law enforcement, you can save a lot of money there too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Lane, I'm looking for that. There we go. Have a question from one of our listeners here, Annie Rodriguez. She writes, can one of the guests speak to the defund the police language, the confusion about what that means and how it could be problematic when people don't understand what is meant?
I can start with this one. So, Annie, I think you're 100% right. I think there is a lot of confusion around this term. I think a lot of people immediately think that defund means abolish the police. I think a lot of people also think that abolish the police means that there's no kind of alternative for public safety that's going to go in the absence of what currently we call policing. And so I think it's just, something that people oftentimes are a little bit deliberately obtuse about. I do think, the textbook dictionary definition of defunding is that you're taking money away. It doesn't mean that you're taking all the money away or, some of the other connotations that are associated with defund. So I think that there is, I think, a problem, but I think it's, a bit overblown. And I think there also are a lot of people who are trying to make it more complicated than it actually is. And, I would say that, the reason that there's a problem that people don't understand it is that I think it really is more than just a phrase. It's a policy platform, right? It's about, taking money from one place and putting it somewhere else. And that's not, that's what we've all been talking about here today. So yeah, I think that, unfortunately, it has kind of been converted into this thing that's, more complicated than it needs to be, sounds scarier than it actually, is. But I think the way to get around that is I think a lot of folks have already started talking about this. And Representative Harry just talked about you don't necessarily have to package this as defunding. It's just kind of let's reinvest in something else. And, I think all the kind of terms that people have come up with to kind of get around the drama that's been created around this term have been helpful, including reimagining public safety, I think has been one of the most palatable ways to talk about this pretty clear policy demand.
Yeah, reimagining public safety is really what we're talking about here. Defund, I mean, I think we just have to acknowledge that that's just gotten way too polarized. And so I think moving towards reimagining is probably more productive.
I would echo both of them and say that Ms. Bond says it's a policy platform, right? It's intentional. It's intentional at this point that they're trying to scare people and those who are just uneducated about it. Oh, they want to take the money away from the police, so it's a scare tactic that's unfortunately working in many instances.
Yeah, thank you. Before I go to Leah and Ann, and then, I thought Sandy was there. There's a question from Joan. What is the name of the organization referring from 9/11, from 911 for mental health issues? What is it? Is it
Cahoots,
that would be
right?
Cahoots?
Yeah.
It's an acronym. I don't remember what it stands for.
I thought I heard that word.
Cahoots is in Eugene, Oregon. It's not an alternative to It is still under 911. So it's that emergency response. I'm not sure if you're asking about what that new federal number is that they're funding. That's not 911. I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem. Most people aren't going to know what that is. And even if you have a different number, people call 911. And it's usually not just one person calling, it's usually multiple people calling. And so that's, I think, going to continue to be a challenge unless you build it into the emergency response systems.
Thank you. We have Leah and then Ann.
Thank you all so much for speaking to us today. And congratulations, Representative Herod. Colorado is an example to the rest of the country, and I'm really proud. My question is about some New York related issues. One, two things that Governor Cuomo did after George Floyd, repealing 50A and Executive Order 203. The first question is about 50A, and 50A was supposed to make police misconduct records public. And as of now, I think only about 40 municipalities have complied with making their misconduct records public. Is there any way to enforce this? It seems like litigation is necessary, and every time I try to deal with police issues or police reform issues, I feel like I need to be a lawyer. The second question was from Executive Order 203. I've heard a lot of municipalities haven't complied with doing a police reform effort, and I'm just wondering if there's any way to enforce that. And thank you very much.
I can take the first stab. I think at 50A at least. Yeah, I think it's really unfortunate that there's been so much reticence and recalcitrance to doing what the law requires you to do. I would note, and it's unfortunate that really litigation has been the primary tool of enforcement. I don't know if there are different avenues that maybe the Attorney General could take and other people who are responsible for making sure laws are complied with. But I do want to note that the New York Civil Liberties Union has done a fantastic kind of program where they've recruited a lot of larger law firms to just kind of sue every county who's not complying. And so that we've seen a lot of, I think, progress on that front. And I know a number of our members who are based in New York are kind of independently suing whenever the information is being withheld. I'm not sure if I have much of an answer for EO 203, but I will see if anybody else has an idea.
This goes back to the systemic problem that I talked about, right? People see the individual officers on the street and think that they're really, in many instances, just the symptom of a greater problem, right? If the governing officials of municipalities are refusing to comply, this sets a domino effect that in the repercussions that are placed upon the people, upon the citizens. You have to change the local government. You have to vote people out and all that, and continue to agitate, as Ms. Bond said, and lawsuits and things like that.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Ann, and then we're going to have Katerina be the last question for this one. Ann?
Hi, everybody. Just really appreciative of this conversation, and so appreciative of our presenters for leading the way and for doing what you're doing so skillfully. Thank you. Absolutely. It's really powerful. The thing that came up as a concern for me recently was reading about, I can't remember which town or city it was, where they defunded the police, but that was kind of the end. and it created a hole and it created problems. And it seems to me we cannot lessen the police, do the defund without immediately inputting the support systems that are so important and needed. It just has to be simultaneous. And then I think we need a catchy phone number for the mental health services, like 911, 912, or not, like something. So do any of you have any thoughts about how do we make sure that this happens immediately, simultaneously, to source the community right away with the help they need?
I mean, I can jump in on the last part of the question. I think these alternative numbers are okay, but they don't necessarily work. So we've had alternative numbers here, mobile crisis units, all this stuff in Denver. But what people don't understand is that you have been taught as a child, when you need something, when your cat's in a tree, when someone's screaming, to call 911. So people still call 911. It might not be you, right? But someone else is going to call 911. And unless it all goes to the exact same dispatch, and one person is triaging that call, you are still going to get a law enforcement officer probably at scene. If someone's running around naked and screaming, you might call the mental health hotline because you care for their mental health. Your neighbors probably all are going to call 911. They're going to put it on next door, and the police are going to come out. And so while we have those units, that they're great, we've got to make sure that we're actually reimagining public safety and making sure that, just like fire, just like paramedics, we have mental health workers who are dispatched in the same way, have the same prestige, and are all trained together. The beautiful thing about Cahoots, and I did a TED Talk on this if you guys want to check it out. The good thing about Cahoots is that when law enforcement did come as well, because there was a weapon, if someone has a shoe in the air, it could be a weapon. If someone, as we know, has Skittles, that could be seen as a weapon. If someone has much less a box cutter and is threatening to harm themselves, law enforcement may still come to scene. But because they are trained together, law enforcement and Cahoots, you saw law enforcement secure the scene, make sure that things were stable, and you saw them step back and Cahoots step forward. And so there was no territorial issues on scene. There was no whose gun is bigger than the others, we'll say. It was really more about how could we work together, and we reformed the system here, and joint accountability. So I would just keep that in mind, because we have tried those alternative numbers, and we've just seen they just don't work as well as integrating mental health into your emergency response system completely.
Thank you.
I would agree with that. The Cahoots program is probably the best, probably the gold star as to how to get this done. As Ms. Harrod said, that they are trained together, and police officers don't want to do this. They don't want to go to health crisis. I mean, I was a member of the crisis intervention team. The vast majority of police officers don't want to go to these types of scenes. They don't want to handle those incidents. They've never wanted to do it. We do it because, who else are you going to send? So the officers need to be better trained in crisis management. But in the meantime, I would certainly advocate for more Cahoot style, somebody completely different, wearing different uniforms, different response types and all that. I definitely advocate for that.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you so very much. Katerina.
Hi, everyone. I was not planning to speak, but I'm so grateful that you all put this together. I'm really, really grateful for the support of Lauren at NPAP, and for Representative Harrod, who joined us at a legislative briefing recently.
Katerina, I'm sorry. Let people know who you are, please.
Sure. I am the co-lead of NQINY, the coalition that Lauren was talking about in New York that's fighting to pass the bill to end qualified immunity in New York State, which I will say I think is one of the, I'm biased, but is one of the best bills in the country, because it addresses and has thought through all of the concerns that you have all raised. both on these individual things, the concerns about the, the holes that the police unions will break. And I could talk about the bill for hours, but instead I'll invite you all to look at our website, ndqiny.org. I just want to mention, though, that, I'm here also on the call with Darlene, who co-leads the campaign, who is in her own battle with qualified immunity for over 4 years, right? And that's what this is all about at the end of the day. I know it's important to talk about, the police component of it, but why are we trying to change this? It's so that families like Darlene, families like the Chamberlain family don't have to deal with the agony of these kinds of cases for 4 years, 10 years. But ultimately, it's about not making sure there is not another Chamberlain family, not another Darlene McDay, family that has to deal with the horrors of this. And so I think, the New York State bill is really, really looking at and addressing those systemic issues. You all raised 50A, incredibly important step in that transparency piece, as Lauren mentioned. You all mentioned the executive 203 processes. Again, all of these reforms are extremely important, but unless we have that accountability, unless we have that culture shift that comes with ending qualified immunity, we are just going to keep going in circles and circles and circles in this conversation. And I think one of the clearest examples is that chokeholds were banned before Eric Gardner was murdered in a chokehold. But as long as people don't have to think before they act, knowing that there are other protections for those split-second decisions that I understand the captain, very reasonably raised, we're not going to move forward. And so I definitely invite all of you to please, especially those of you in New York, but there's so many other organizations fighting in other states, but to please join us. I know many of you specifically are in Westchester and Yonkers, and I cannot overstate how important your role specifically will be in this fight. As Lauren mentioned, the really important thing, and unfortunately one of the big differences from the process in Colorado, is we are still working to get leadership in the Senate on board. The leader of the Senate is your senator in Westchester and Yonkers, and so please, visit our website, the Take Action page, call her, flood Andrews, your cousin's email inbox. We have, tools. You can text go NQINY to 50409. There's a button on our website that, that'll do that automatically. That'll automatically send a message to your representatives, urging them to co-sponsor and support the bill to end qualified immunity. And to please stay connected with us on Twitter, because we are cooking up a lot of really, really amazing things with our amazing allies and supporters across the state and across the country, such as NPAP. So thank you for having this conversation, because it's a complicated topic, and the more people who are educated on this and realize the absurdity of the doctrine and the impact that it has ultimately on people like the Chamberlain family and Darlene's family, the more that we're sure we are going to get this passed in New York this year. So thank you.
Yeah, and it's good to see you again. Your work is amazing. I see Ms. McDay is on the phone as well, or on this call. I'll just add one thing that Katarina didn't say. First of all, I love the New York bill, and I love your organizing out there. We can all help by retweeting, re-Facebooking, sharing, whatever, and making sure that people know this activity is going on in New York. But also, we can elevate this to any type of influencers that we know. Social media influencers is really important. Like Kim Kardashian recently came because of the trucker in Colorado who was sentenced to 110 years for an accident on our mountain roads. And he's a Latino. And I will tell you what, because of that, the case is being reopened, and the governor is calling for a clemency petition to be written, and we will probably change the law because of it. That happened with Elijah McClain as well. And so keep that in mind for whatever random connections you have. And then finally, do me one big favor and send them a check or go online and donate to their organization, 5, 10, 50, 100, 1,000, whatever you have to give, because the activists who are doing this work are not doing anything else. They are losing time working, especially the attorneys. Shouldn't say especially, but also the attorneys. And they should be paid for their organizing efforts. So if you could do me a favor and do that today, I think that would make a big difference in their organizing.
Thank you, Representative Herod. That is why you are good at what you do.
Oh, what a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful session as usual here at Race Talk Revolution. I want to give our guests a minute for any final words.
Just thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to help out in any way that I can. Would love to come back out to New York, Connecticut, keep pushing, doing all the amazing work, and whatever else I can do, I'm happy to help out. Again, our goal is to make sure that these cases don't continue to happen, that we don't lose another Elijah McClain, that we don't have another Miss McDay, that we have law enforcement officers on our streets who are sworn to serve and protect, that they actually do. And that we could trust that. And so keep up the work. It's really hard. The climate is really tough right now because of the crime narrative and the organization to push against these things. Bring facts and bring truth to the narrative. And I do believe that we will find justice at the end. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have much to add other than thank you. Out of all the places that we are prioritizing here at NPAP, all the states, all the issues, Indian QI in New York is top tier. So if you have limited capacity to get engaged somewhere, please do it in New York and in all the ways that Katerina and Representative Herod have already listed. And thank you all so much for having us here.
I would say thank you so much for having me here. It was a great honor and great privilege. I would say I would advocate for more and better and longer training for officers who are entering the police academy. The average is about 6 months of training. Think about what we're asking police officers to do with 6 months of training, right? I also advocate that police officers within 5 years of getting on the job complete their bachelor's degree. And I also advocate, obviously, for de-escalation training. And if anyone is, I'm going to give a shameless plug here. I have a podcast called Captain Hunter's Podcast, where I've talked about just about every single issue that we've discussed here today. So if anyone is wanting to listen to that, please, if you have a podcast, or you like to go for walks or work out or wash dishes, go to Captain Hunter's Podcast and check it out. So that's it.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of our panelists, Colorado State Representative Leslie Herod, Ms. Lauren Bonds, the Legal Director of the National Police Accountability Project, and author and podcast person, the retired police captain Lawrence Hunter. Now, as usual, we encourage everyone here to continue to engage in conversations with people who are not like you, to continue to seek out learning and growth opportunities, and to actively look for and engage in local and national organizing efforts. Lane?
Yes, thank you so much to our panelists today. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our wonderful Race Talk Revolution family. We urge you to keep educating yourself about this topic, and also wanted to remind you that there are opportunities to deepen your understanding of systemic racism and how you can be an anti-racist activist. I did put some places that you can get training in the chat. If you were someone who was looking into the Undoing Racism workshop and noticed that the Faith Coalition had to postpone that training, there are some other opportunities where you can get trainings with the exact same analysis. You can go to the Anti-Racist Alliance page and get some information about trainings there. And also we have Equity Consulting Network, so you can go to either of those places as well. Wanted to let you know that we will be returning on January 12th. Thank you to our collaborators on this panel discussion, Anti-Racist Alliance and Westchester Coalition for Police Reform. We wish everybody a loving and safe holiday. Please support your local charities. They really need your help. And if you're looking for someplace to make a year-end donation, we are also fully tax deductible. Thank you for continuing to support Race Talk with your time and your participation and your love. And thank you for sharing this past year with us. It's been a roller coaster ride. And we wish you all to be abundantly blessed in 2022. And may we all move closer to creating a world that works for everyone. You all, we love you. Be safe, be blessed. Take care.
All righty. Joan, we should have that recording up and posted in what, about a week or so, a few days, Lane?
Yeah, it'll definitely be up by Friday.
Okay, there you go. Goodbye, everyone.